What is up guys, welcome back to the channel. This is Dr. Hammerstein and today we got 3 very powerful Poco phones here and 3 flagship killers in its own right. And of course talking about the Poco X3 Pro, the Poco X3 GT and one of my favorite phones here in 2021, the Poco F3. So what we are going to do today is of course check out the key specs and features of 3 of these phones, check them out side by side with each other and of course help you to decide which one would be the best for you. So without further ado, let's just get right into it. So we're going to start off things here with the prices on all 3 of these phones, and I will also be including the sale prices as well because they do go on sale almost every month, and I will also include the USD prices as well. So starting here with the Poco X3 Pro, the base model starts off at 999 ringgit. If you want the highest spec model, you can get it for 1299. During the sales, of course, the lower spec will go for 899 ringgit. If you want the highest spec model, you can get it for 999 ringgit. Next up, we have the Poco X3 GT, and this one here, the base model starts off at 1299, and if you want the highest spec model, you can get it for 1599 ringgit. Of course, during the sales, you can get the base model for 1199, and of course, if you want the highest spec model, you can get it for 1399 ringgit Malaysia. And lastly over here with the Poco F3, this one starts off at 1399 for the base model, and if you want the highest spec model, you can get it for 1699 ringgit Malaysia. And of course during the sales, this one will go down for the base model to 1299, and if you want the highest spec model, you can get it for 1499 ringgit Malaysia. So now let's check out the build and design on all 3 of these phones, and I'm going to start off here with the X3 GT and the Pro because both of them do use a plastic on the back and a glass panel on the front. And looking at the design and also the camera layout over here, we can see that of course they are very different from each other. With the X3 Pro, I really like this kind of gaming feel over here. You do have your blue and purple hue here as well, which does look pretty cool. And if we look on to the X3 GT, it does look a bit more premium compared to the Pro variant. Going on to the front over here, you do get your Gorilla Glass Victus, the latest and greatest from Corning Gorilla. Looking at the X3 Pro, it does also have a very good Gorilla Glass over here. It does come with a Corning Gorilla Glass 6. Now let's switch it up and check it out, the Poco F3 over here. This one here, you do have a glass sandwich. You have your Gorilla Glass 5 on the front and also on the back here as well. 3 of these phones do have a very similar pattern. They do have your side-mounted fingerprint scanner over here, which also acts as your power button. You also do have your volume rockers here as well. One thing to note is that on the X3 Pro, it does have a headphone jack, something that the Poco F3 and the X3 GT do not have. So next thing I want to talk about here are the displays on all 3 of these phones. So starting with the sizes, both the X3 Pro and the Poco F3 come in with a bigger display over here, 6.67 inch compared to the Poco X3 GT 6.6 inch display. In terms of the panel we're using, both the X3 Pro and GT use an LCD panel over here, whereas on the Poco F3 it uses an E4 AMOLED display. In terms of the peak brightness over here, the Poco F3 does have a better peak brightness with the X3 GT coming in at 3rd place. All 3 of these phones do have a 120Hz refresh rate, which is something really common in 2021. In terms of the screen calibration or the color scheme over here, both the Poco X3 Pro and the Poco F3 do have a colder tone compared to the X3 GT's warmer tone. So now let's check out the stereo speakers on all 3 of these phones. And one good thing that all 3 phones do have is an IP53 rating, so it is dust and splash resistance, which isn't something common you're gonna find here in this price range. So now let's check out the software side of things over here, and on all 3 of these phones, they're running the same version over here, MIUI 12.5.2. But one thing to note is that on the Poco F3, it does have an extra feature over here, AI image engine, so it does have that MEMC chip and also this other stuff as well because it does use an AMOLED display. Other than this, they all have the quick board features, they have the double tap feature as well. All the other functions, the customizations are very similar on all 3 of these phones. So next thing here I want to talk about is the battery on all three of these phones, and starting off with the sizes over here, the X3 Pro does come with the biggest one over here, 5160. In second place, the X3 GT does come with 5000 mAh of battery, and over here with the Poco F3, it does come with a 4520 mAh of battery. Next thing here I'm going to talk about is the charging on all three of these phones. So both the Poco F3 and X3 Pro do use this 33 watt brick charger over here, so it's able to charge up from 0 all the way to 100% in just under an hour as advertised on their website. But over here with the X3 GT, it does come with a 67 watt brick charger over here, so it's able to charge up from 0 all the way to 100% in just over half an hour, 42 minutes as advertised. But of course, if we talk about actual battery performance, to be honest, the Poco F3 and X3 GT do perform better compared to the X3 Pro, which is quite surprising because it does have the bigger battery size over here. In terms of just the average usage, the screen on time, this one over here does give me a good 6 hours, but over here, it does give me about 5 hours to 5.5 hours of screen on time. So next thing here is one of the most important thing among three of these phones, and of course this is the internal hardware on all three of these phones. Both the Poco F3 and the X3 Pro do use a Snapdragon processor, whereas on the X3 GT it uses a MediaTek chipset. So starting here with the Poco X3 Pro, this one does come with the Snapdragon 860, which is sort of the rebranded 855 edition. In terms of the performance, it's really good, and then of course in terms of the internal hardware, it starts off with 6 gigs of RAM and 128 gigs of storage, but you can get the higher spec model over here with 8 gigs of RAM and 256 gigs of storage. This one over here is really interesting because it doesn't have any 5G support, but it does have your micro SD expansion, which is something a lot of people would like to have. Over here with the X3 GT, it does come with the MediaTek Dimensity 1100 with 5G support. There isn't any micro SD expansion over here, so you can get the base model over here for 8 gigs of RAM and 128 gigs of storage. If you want to bump it up, you can get it with 8 gigs of RAM and 256 gigs of storage. And lastly over here we have the Poco F3, and this one here does come with the Snapdragon 870, which is the more of the 865 plus edition. And over here you also do have 5G support but do not have any micro SD expansion slot, similar to the X3 GT. The base model over here starts off with 6 gigs of RAM and 128 gigs of storage. If you get the high spec model, you can get it with 8 gigs of RAM and 256 gigs of storage. And lastly over here, let's talk about those cameras. For the Poco X3 Pro, it does come with a 20 megapixel f2.2 selfie camera, and it can record up to 1080p at 30 fps. Switching on to the back over here, it does come with a quad camera setup. Starting off with the main lens over here, 48 megapixel f1.8 main lens and 8 megapixel ultra wide f2.2. Two 2 megapixel f2.4 cameras, one for your macro and one for your depth cameras. Next up we have the X3 GT, and it does come with a 16 megapixel f2.5 selfie camera, and of course if you switch on to the back, you do have your triple camera setup. It does come with a 64 megapixel f1.8 main lens, an 8 megapixel f2.2 ultra wide and a 2 megapixel f2.4 macro shooter. And lastly over here with the Poco F3, it does come with a 20 megapixel f2.5 selfie shooter, and going on to the back over here, it also uses a triple camera setup with a 48 megapixel f1.8 main sensor, an 8 megapixel f2.2 ultra wide and a 5 megapixel f2.4 macro shooter. So going on to the selfie video over here, all three phones can record up to 1080p at 30 fps, but for the F3, it can go up to 60 fps. In terms of dynamic range, color, details and all this other good stuff, all three of these phones I think is doing a good job. Going on to another favorite feature over here that I have used, this is the dual video, and I think this is very helpful for you guys who are interested in a lot of vlogging. In terms of color, they are quite different from each other, but overall all three of them are really good. I do feel the X3 GT is a little bit smoother compared to the rest. Going on to the rear cameras over here at 1080p at 30 fps, I think all of them are pretty smooth. I do feel that the F3 and the X3 Pro is actually smoother compared to the X3 GT. In terms of dynamic range and colors, all of them are pretty similar. But you will notice something very unusual here at 1080p at 60 fps, and the F3 here looks like a hot mess. As you can see here, it's very shaky for some reason, even with image stabilization on. On the other phones, the X3 Pro and the X3 GT, they are pretty good. And lastly over here at 4K at 30 FPS in the max settings, all three of them I think do give a very good results. I do feel that with the X3 GT, it does have a better dynamic range compared to the other two phones. Overall, all three of them are still pretty good. So shots taken with the main lenses on all three of these phones do give you a slightly different hue compared to each other, and I do like the dynamic range on all three of these phones. In terms of the color, I feel that the X3 Pro and F3 is a little bit more saturated compared to the X3 GT. In terms of details and dynamic range, again, all three of them are pretty similar, I would say. I think the X3 GT does have a slightly better dynamic range compared to the other two phones, but it does tend to blow out the skies at the back over here. In these images, you'll notice that all three of them are still really good. Going on to the ultra wide over here, the F3 does go a little bit inconsistent, followed by the X3 GT and the X3 Pro. Surprisingly though, the X3 Pro with the cheapest phone over here does give you a very good ultra wide shot. It does give you the most consistent among the three. And one more thing over here, I want to show you that the macro lens on all three of these phones are really quite useless, I would say. Even though the F3 does have the 5 megapixel lens, it does give you the least details compared to the X3 Pro and the GT. And going on to some selfie shots over here, I do like the shots taken with the F3. It does give you very good dynamic range, good details and sharpness compared to the other three phones. In terms of the X3 GT, I think this is the worst one over here of the bunch, even behind the X3 Pro. And lastly over here, let's check out some night shots on all three phones, and I have to be honest over here, the Poco F3 doesn't look that great at all. The X3 GT and the Pro does look better with a lot more details and color, although the color is a little bit different from each other. Going on to some other shots over here, we can see they do still give you good details in general, and also they do trade blows pretty often. As we can see with the X3 GT, it is the least compared to the F3 and X3 Pro when it comes to brightening up those shadows. And going on to some ultra wide shots over here, we can see that the F3 again does give you the most flashed out photo among the X3 Pro and GT. So that is it between the Poco F3, the X3 GT and the X3 Pro. So the ultimate question is, which one should you get? For me personally, I would go for the Poco F3 because it does offer the best value to performance ratio. It does have your nice glass sandwich, and most importantly, you do have your E4 AMOLED display. Of course, if you want to save a little bit of money over here, I think the X3 Pro does make a lot of sense. It almost does have the same amount of features as the other two phones at a much lower price point. Of course, here with the X3 GT, it's a little bit of an awkward child over here, but I do understand that some people do like an LCD panel because it tends to last longer compared to an AMOLED display. So of course, with this LCD panel, and of course, if you want very good performance, I think here with the X3 GT, it does fit that bill very nice. Of course, these are just my thoughts and my opinion. Do leave yours in the comment section down below. If you guys did find this video helpful and also did enjoy this, do click the like and smash the subscribe button down below for more videos like this in the future. Do also follow me on my social as well on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and also here on YouTube at Dr. Hamstech. So that is it. This is Dr. Hamstech. Stay safe, take care, and wash those hands.